Hello and welcome back, everyone. I don't know how good the sound quality on this one is going to be. It's very difficult trying to keep up with everything, having neurogenic thoracic outlet syndrome, and keyword trying, to maintain and keep a job with this condition is proving to be extraordinarily difficult. Today, though, I wanted to talk about some ideas and some thinking that I've been doing. I started asking myself the question, where does the root of tyranny come from? Like things of devastation, things like genocide or violence, corruption, rape, murder, especially when it's done by an entire state, culture, or country. At first, my conclusion, honestly, was, is it men? Are males the predominant key factor? And where we see tyrannical groups or tyrannical or tyrant actions from groups and activism start up, is it predominantly males, or is it only males? My answer to that, of course, obviously, hopefully you already know, is no. As females have proven in the past, over the years, over centuries in history, to be just as much tyrannical and capable of being dictators and rulers that rule with brute force and violence. So the answer is not females, or is not males. It females as well. It has nothing to do with gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, anything like that. I started asking myself, though, like, where does this concept originate from to try and rule people with fear tactics and violence and all that sort of stuff? Ultimately, what I came up with was this, and like I said, this is just thinking, is that it is institutions. It is societies. I mean, institutions can be a great number of things, and what I find interesting about institutions is they usually carry with them some kind of dogmatic principle with them. Institution can be multi-conglomerate corporations. Institution can be statism. Institution and dogma can also be nationalism. Institution can be a form of conservatism where you are stuck in tradition. One of the things that I started thinking about is that there is a Middle Eastern country, I forget which one does this, but it is a Muslim country, Islamic, and every year, as an annual thing, one thing that this particular culture does is there is a march of predominantly men, there's boys, like as young as 9 or 12. They march down the street and they flog themselves to the point of bleeding. And I also thought, well, there's this very patriarchal culture that I've seen in Africa where the women participate in an activity where they literally beat the shit out of themselves. Supposedly this is to try and show that they are worthy or worthy of a mate or trying to get a mate. So they beat the shit out of themselves to prove that they are tough enough to be the mate of a particular male. I find that deeply patriarchal and unfair, but I think dogma and institution is where the real evil of tyranny lays. As I've said many, many times before, and I haven't been disproven or rebuked on this, is that violence is the primitive reaction to that which you cannot control. Even in the instance, which is very rational and logical and understandable, of self-defense, it is still a primitive reaction to that which you cannot control. So a lot of these institutions, things like the Catholic Church, there's many, many, many institutions of religion that this applies to. And governments, statism, nationalism, particularly that of dogmatic principles on any of these institutions. The thing that I started noticing is that society itself does not need institution. Society can exist without institution, but the institutions themselves, just like any other form of violence, is that they become violent when there is something that is out of their control. It is a primitive reaction to that which they cannot control. So when people exist in these institutions that desire power and control over a populace of people, they usually try to silence the opposition, which is usually a form of thought. I was thinking, people out there, that when I talk about these cultures where the women beat the shit out of themselves, or the Middle Eastern country where part of their culture is to walk down the street annually every year and flog themselves, that it might be perceived that I'm being insensitive towards their culture. But the real reality is that there's probably already people amongst them that have the idea that, why are we doing this? This could be done differently. Why must we engage in self-deprecation? For the sake of what? For the sake of tradition? For the sake of proving to a man that I am worthy? And it's those people that get silenced, or that the institution tries to silence, because even if that person, let's say like a person like me, who is physically broken, it's very threatening when somebody has a thought or has a line of thinking that goes outside the box and gets you to the point of questioning the institution itself. Is that, the way that I see it is that when I look at these cultures, is what they're doing humanitarian? Is it egalitarian? Is it ethical? Is it necessary? And my answer to both of the instances and examples that I gave is no. So even though I may be some Westerner that is perceived by many as maybe colonization and trying to spread Western philosophy to cultures and places that don't need it, I guarantee you there are already people within that culture that are already thinking the same thing. But the problem is the institution sees that as an insurgent, and they will do everything in their power to try and keep that idea from spreading, because they want to maintain control. And believe me, they cannot control the populace on these ideas of trying to progress forward, because the real reality is that the human species is always striving to want to obtain more civil liberties, freedoms, and what have you. That people desire a world in where they don't have to engage in self-deprecation, where they don't have to worry about a tyrannical leader starving them to death, putting them into camps, trying to eliminate certain aspects of the population, trying to commit something like genocide. You will basically, the idea is that hope will never be silent. Is that human beings have a knack of always wanting better. They want the institution to be better. They want to be treated better. They want to exist within that institution without pain and suffering and everything that comes along with that. As they absolutely should have the right to desire to be treated with respect and dignity as a human being. And one of the reasons I bring up one of the examples of institution that does this is institutions like to get inside your head and manipulate you and make you think you don't have a choice. Like, let's say you work for a multi-conglomerate corporation. The multi-conglomerate corporation likes to get in your head and make you think you don't have a choice in this. You have to come here and you have to do this because you need monetary gain for resource, for a roof over your head, for food, for shelter, for water, for medical aid. But the truth, the real reality is that the institution in that case cannot keep you from walking out the door and looking for a different institution that will treat you better and give you, not treat you like a replacement for farm animals and farm equipment, but treat you like a human being deserving of humanitarian respect. Seriously, we do not need institution. The big question there is, when you talk about institution of government. And again, the people who are in power, even in our lovely democratic republic of the United States, you're talking about a group of people that have a lot of desire for power and control. You basically have a court in the United States of tyrannical kings and queens competing for power, with a few of them in there that actually want to be leaders of people and not tyrannical control freaks. That is at least my perception of it. That is a way of dumbing it down. It's a way of simplistically putting it to make it more easily digestible and easily understood. It's obviously more complicated than just that. But for the sake of making it simple, I'm just going to put it that way. So, another thing that the institutions will do, and that the positive side, let me go back. The positive side of an institution like a multi-conglomerate corporation treating people like the replacement for farm equipment and farm animals is that, at least in countries like the United States and other Western countries, if you want to speak out and you want to change things, the very worst they could possibly do, and you will be perceived by that institution as an endangerment just for thought, is the very worst they will try to do is terminate your employment so that you don't spread these ideas to the rest of the employees, because the people in charge get very itchy when you start spreading these type of ideas and letting people know, no, actually you do have a choice, that Actually, within the individual stores and locations, there is a sense of community. And that's an interesting thing to point out, is that the sense of community does not need to be met by an institution. So, like with religion, let's say, when it comes to religion, you absolutely have the right to believe whatever you want to believe. But the difference between turning religion into an institution versus living in a community of people that have compassion and empathy and sympathy and work as a community together is you might have a disagreement on belief, but there is no institution that tries to silence dissent of belief with aggression and violence. And that's really the big difference there. So I think the actual root and cause of tyranny comes from an institution's desire to control the populace, not only in behavior, but also control the population in a means of being able to think critically, deductively, and logically, to understand that, wait a minute here, I have a lot more freedoms, civil rights, liberties, and freedoms that are not being explored than what they want me to explore. And unfortunately, I think in Western civilization, at least here in the United States I can speak of, is that there's sort of a problem where people aren't really taught to think critically. So people are not thinking in terms of, we could really change things. Like right now, in this country, if you wanted to create an uprising against multi-conglomerate corporations and basically say, let's take, for example, a Walmart. Let's say you work at a Walmart. You could turn that Walmart and the people who work there into a community, and if everybody works together, possibly even annex that particular store from the corporation itself and say, look, you created this new guideline or rule or regulation that is very anti-humanitarian and creates a lot of turmoil, strife, and pain for the individuals that work. And at this particular location, let's say that the store manager all the way down to the very bottom all agree as a community that this is inappropriate and that they're not going to enforce this new policy that the institution has come up with. There's not a whole lot that institution can do in this country. Is that even though the country as an institution doesn't like the idea, they can't just storm in with a bunch of guns and shoot everyone that has this descending idea of changing things, as this would not only be perceived as anti-humanitarian, but it would be covered by pretty much every major news outlet in the world as a complete travesty and not be accepted in any way, shape, or form by the rest of the world and other countries. Like it would be met with a lot of resistance, and it would be seen as something purely unacceptable, unethical, and many people would describe it as evil. So the people in this situation, there is no need for bloodshed. If they just stood their ground, it would come down to the principle of, what are you going to do about it? We as a community here are going to operate this place like a community. And we're not going to enforce this, that, and the other. And that we're going to be humane and treat our people humanely. And what are you going to do about it? And the answer is that the institution in this case, in this country, can't do anything about it except capitulate. And no bloodshed is needed. Unfortunately, a lot of the times, insurgency doesn't happen until bloodshed is needed. And you look at instances like the Bolsheviks and what happened over there with the serfs and what happened in places like Germany and with the Holocaust and Hitler's bullshit that he pulled, is that by the time that happens, you can't have insurgency without bloodshed. Bloodshed is absolutely needed, and then the whole humanitarian effort of trying to negate violence altogether, as violence being a primitive reaction to that which you cannot control, is completely thrown out the window. It's absolutely necessary at that point.
So, unfortunately, I think the answer
to getting rid of tyranny altogether is the negation and absence of institution. Because it's the institution of religion, it's the institution of multi-conglomerate corporations, it's the institution of government, the institution of statism, the institution of nationalism dogmatically. It is the institution of various churches. It is an institution that ultimately engages in the most abhorrent acts of tyranny, of dictatorship, that uses violence and control, because they can't ultimately control, and so the primitive reaction in that case is to use violence to control. It's terrorism, it's an abusive ad hominem. So how you do that is, well, I've called myself an anarcho-nihilist. Well, anarcho-nihilism is the idea of the absence or the negation of institution without the absence or negation of society. So it's about creating community. And the interesting reality is that human beings have created society without institution before. That is something that can exist, has existed, but can it exist? Can society or community exist on a large scale of the cities that we have today, populated by human beings as large as the population is, without institution? And that is a significant question, and probably not very likely that it can, unfortunately. But I think that is the root of tyranny and oppression, is institution. And that does include things like tradition, a very particular type of conservatism, where there is not room for growth and change of people to be able to say, hey, this could be done differently. Maybe we don't have to walk down the street every year beating the shit out of ourselves. So, like I said, many people might see that as being insensitive to that culture or religion, but I guarantee you there's already people in that crowd that have that thought and are just too scared or terrified to actually come out and say anything, because they know the institution that practices that will try to beat the shit out of them, beat them to death, kill them, or find various ways of silencing this sort of ideology that goes against the narrative and acts as a sort of insurgency for change. That is what I was able to come up with. This is something that I've been thinking about repeatedly for a while. There's actually more to it than just this, but for time's sake, I'm going to keep it short. I just I wanted to get this into a video and be able to put it out there. With that, I will say support the idea of choices and not one's ability to impose one's will on others against their own will. And with that, I'm out.